Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this roundtable. The topic this morning is flooding, which I'm sure you all know has been very topical in recent times because the serious impact it is having all around the world. To give you a few examples, in 2016 alone, we have saw heavy storms and subsequent flooding events in Europe, affecting France and Germany, amongst others. According to the Weather German service, the flash floods experience were the worst ever seen in Germany. Meanwhile, in the US, we have the example of Louisiana, where 13 people died, 100,000 people were displaced, and 20,000 businesses were damaged or destroyed. In addition, if we cross the globe to China, we can see the effect of climate change very clearly, with flooding being attributed to El Niño. And finally, as I'm sure you are aware, in the past we've also seen big floods in Thailand, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. So why is all of this important? Well, flooding affects more people and properties than any other natural peril. And the management of this risk involves all key stakeholders, including the insurance industry, consumers, and governments. So we are going to discuss now and for the next hour is why this is happening, what we know and don't know about the link between climate change and flooding, what the impact of all this is on the insurance industry, and what the best approach to managing this very serious hazard is. To help us, we are fortunate to have two experts, Peter Hosman from Swiss Re and Adam Podlaha from Aon Benfield Impact Forecasting. First of all, Adam is going to talk to us about the phenomena of flooding, and then Peter is going to tell us about how to manage flood risk, specifically in terms of underwriting and the accumulation control processes. Finally, we'll go back to Adam, who will use the example of Canada to show us how to deal with flood risk. Each speaker which have about 20 minutes. And after that, we will have approximately 20 minutes for a panel discussion in which I will ask Adam and Peter questions to expand on what they've told us. Finally, we'll finish off with a few minutes for questions from the audience. So now I'll hand you over to our first speaker, who is Adam Podlaha. Adam is the head of impact forecasting at Aon Benfield, where he oversees a large team of catastrophe model developers dealing with many perils in over 60 countries. He holds a PhD in physical geography from Charles University in Prague, and he initially joined Aon Benfield as a flood model developer in 2003. Thank you, Adam.
Muchas gracias. Se llama Adam y soy de República Checa y vivo en Inglaterra. That's all you are going to get from me. However, I am from the Czech Republic and I live in the UK, so I have two passports, the European Union one and the non-European Union one. So it's a fantastic combination. Okay, thank you for the introduction, as I said, and I'm really glad to be here speaking about flood modeling and how does it apply to, let's say, global client like Mapfre and clients of Mapfre. I will be speaking from the model developer points of view. So I'm part of Aon Benfield. Impact forecasting is part of Aon Benfield. We concentrate on developing models. So my first topic is to speak about climate change and the link with flood losses. So as I say here, keep calm, okay? I'm a CAD model developer. I will try to speak in very blunt terms. I will not be using any abbreviations, hopefully, and if I do, I will explain those things. Okay, so this is a trend of economical losses since 1980. Only flood, and it's a non-tropical cyclone. Now, if you look at it, you see that it's highly variable, and there is some sort of trend. So you can see there's a 10-year moving average, and you can maybe see some trend, maybe. Okay. Now this, just to say the numbers, were grossed by the U.S. Consumer Price Index. So it's all, let's say, linked to 2016. Now we will also look at the same numbers, but by region. So this is, sorry for it's a bit small, but this is for EMEA region. So you can see really probably no trend. I will let you to work it out. And this is for Americas. And this is for Asia Pacific. So you can see that the trend in economic losses is not very clear. And we'll come to the climate change factor a bit later. And it's a question also, especially for Asia Pacific, where maybe the trend is you can see some increase, how much it is linked with better reporting of losses. Okay. Now, these are the insured costs. And I'll put here only global numbers. And you can see in the insured costs, the trend is increase of losses for flood. Again, since 1980, excludes the tropical cyclone flood-related losses. So the conclusion from this is no matter if there is climate change or not, the insured losses are going up. And that's a challenge for insurance companies and for individual commercial companies who are trying to protect themselves, but also opportunity. Actually, if this growth is not there, probably many of us will not sit here, including myself, because I will have no job creating models. So that's to start with. Now, I wanted to mention here some factors. So let's speak about climate change, because that's the topic of my first part. There is lots of weather variability in general, and climate variability, we should say climate variability, which is not linked with climate change. Now, I just wanted to show here on this slide the change in precipitation. So this is since the beginning of 1901, this is 1951 until 2010. And it shows the, let's say, the annual precipitation, the change per decade, okay? And the average, basically. And you can see that since 1901, the trend is so sort of, if you take all the numbers, it seems a bit slower than if you take it from 1951. The brown numbers means drier, so there is, let's say, 25 millimeters per year less per decade. The blue is there is more. So if you look, actually, if you zoom in Spain, it will be drier. And there is a less precipitation observed in the last 100 years or last 50 years. And there's no discussion. And in some places, it will get wetter. Okay? And you can see the wetter will be the blue ones. But it's not directly linked. You cannot say weather means more losses and it's directly linked with that. Even that there probably is some link. So probably the more important factor in increasing losses is actually the urbanization. So first, people migrate from rural areas to cities. And if you have bigger concentrations, you have basically bigger concentration of flood risk. That's by definition. And also when people are moving towards the coasts. So there's a migration to the cities, bigger concentration, migration to the coast, bigger concentration to flood risk, and also, and for sure, that people are getting more and more insured. Therefore, the insured losses are going really up, and you can see that. Okay. So I would like to conclude on this first session of mine, which is the economic losses globally for flood are increasing slightly. The increase I saw globally since 1980 to 2016 is 4.5%. So that was the first slide I have shown. And it's very hard to say this is due to climate change because Asia Pacific plays a big role and the reporting since 1980 has just improved a lot. So probably one of the biggest roles is the concentration, the urbanization, the insurance penetration. In terms of insured costs, that's going up, and we spoke why, 16%. And one of the biggest opportunity I see is actually the fact that only 12% of the economical losses caused by flood are insured. And I think this is the greatest opportunity for people who are having the risk, for the insurance companies, the reinsurance companies, and of course, model developers. So I think this is really the biggest challenge. No matter what is happening with climate change, because of other factors, the exposure to flood is increasing. And I'm missing there'll be some few more events here. This is a picture from one of the recent events in US, but there have been events, as you know, lots of them in US. There was an event in Canada in 2013. There have been events in Central Eastern Europe. There have been events in Vietnam, Philippines, all over the place. And some of them are less insured than the other. Of course, US is driving it as one of the most insured. And I will speak about US a little bit later and during the questions, I think, as well. Okay.
That was very informative. And now we'll move on to our second speaker, who is Peter Hosman from Swiss Re, where he is currently heading the Cat Perils Europe Hub and also leading Swiss Re's CatNet services. He holds a degree in rural engineering and geodesy from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and initially working as a consulting engineer in groundwater modeling. He joined Swiss Re in Zurich in 1990, where he gained experience as a specialist in storms and floods. Later, he took over project responsibility for Swiss Re's in-house NatCat pricing tools for atmospheric perils, flood, and earthquake. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Josefina. First of all, a really big thank you for the invitation to speak here to you. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure, of course, to explain you a couple of things about flood risk management. To make the link to what you just heard in the first part of Adam's presentation, let me start with a map. I like maps much more than statistics. And what you see here is now the focus on the insured losses of the roughly 45 years. And what you see are big losses, so losses are aggregated here, which were higher than 45 million US dollar. And what's very obvious is if we look at the insured losses, the picture looks very special. So you see that mainly the US and Western Europe show these blue bubbles, which can go up to 5 to 25 billion damage or loss per event. And you also see that then in the rest of the world, there is a bit in Asia, but then South America, not too many bubbles, also Africa, more or less nothing. This, of course, does not mean that there are no events, but as Adam showed before, it's really like this, that only a good 10% of the flood losses are typically insured. And this shows very well that, of course, there is a big opportunity, but also whenever we have flood insurance, it's very relevant, thinking of the huge losses, that you have a reasonable approach regarding flood risk management. I will split my part into three sections. First of all, I would like to give you an insight in the easy way of flood risk management, and then rather in short, because Adam comes back to that also, then we have a look into the more complex way, and I would like to conclude with some input about uncertainties in this whole process. So, the easy way. I speak here now mainly really about single location risk assessment and then about aggregation in this part and not yet about modeling. And first of all, in the easy approach, it's of course very relevant that you check your location about the flood risk. And if I speak here about the flood risk, I have to point out, especially looking at that map here, that the focus is typically mainly on flood risk along the rivers, but in principle you can have flood losses more or less everywhere. We know that typically in a case of a flood event that a good 70% of the losses happen really in these flood zones, and some 30% you find then more or less distributed a bit everywhere. And it's very obvious, as you see on the screen here, that if you don't know your exact location here at the river Ebro, it's very difficult to use information as you have it available in the flood maps. And for those who knows the CatNet we offer to our clients and also to the brokers, we offer flood zones for the whole world, which give you a good indication about where do you face a risk and where not. Now, it's very obvious. As soon as you deal with corporate risks, insuring companies with many locations, checking each and every location can be quite an effort. This means you use or you need a kind of a swift process. You need a tool where you typically then really take your information you have, and hopefully you have at least an exact address of your company location. You have hopefully the sums insured, and so in the end you can upload an Excel sheet, for example, into a tool. This can be a tool like SQL, but maybe you know that Josefina is checking on that of an implementation of a SQL tool here in Mapfre, but it can also be in a tool like CatNet. And the first step is always you translate your address into coordinates, because only if you have a coordinate you can end up with a map like this here of a real example of a Swiss company which has locations around the globe. And if you also upload an amount of the sums insured, you can even show with some colors where you have the key locations. A next step then is of course that you do a lookup of all these flood zone information you have available in these zones, and you can aggregate within your Excel sheet. Then as you see here in the lower right corner, you can add the return periods you find for those locations which fall into a flood zone. And based on this initial information, of course, you can go on. Maybe you then just take a tariff if you have to come up with a premium in the end, and you adjust that tariff according to the flood information, or maybe you go for a model-based approach. I don't want to go there into the details, but would like to proceed with the accumulation process. And here, having these tools at hand, it's also helpful, of course, if you zoom a bit in to certain locations, to see, for example, that as the small picture here in the middle, that you are maybe very lucky with the coordinate you have at the moment, and you have to be aware if that coordinate is a bit more to the left or the right, the result from the flood zone lookup could be different. Or maybe you see, as in the most right small picture here, that probably your address encoding the coordinate you have got is not correct at all. So if you move on then and you think of the many schedule of values you have imported in your tool, maybe you would like to do some kind of an accumulation control with your whole book. And there you can go very many ways. As you see here, I listed the most relevant ones, the most relevant parameters up here. So you could aggregate, of course, insured values. That's one option. On the right hand side, you see just an example, assuming that you have maybe a location with a total insured values of 100 million. You just aggregate these values, maybe which fall into the flood zone. Or you aggregate just the limits. Maybe you have just a limit of 10 million insured. Or then if you would like to become a bit more accurate, you have an approach to assess a flood estimated maximum loss. We relate at Swiss Re typically an EML to a 200-year event. Or maybe you rather prefer a PML, a kind of a worst case event. Then maybe you would aggregate the 25 million in this example here. Or even more detailed, then you relate maybe a typical loss per flood zone. I said here 8% of the TIV maybe, and you aggregate these values, or last but not least, maybe you have even a scenario you deal with. So really many options. If we move top down with the options here, we can say the accuracy of your accumulation control is increasing. So this is about the aggregation, just summing the values up. Of course, what is very relevant is that you take the correlation into approach. So you should make your mind up which locations could be affected by the same event. And here again, you can do this in a very simple way. Maybe you start with just aggregating per country. And just to illustrate this a bit here with the example of the Peru event recently, where we have this very heavy precipitation in the northern part of Peru, then you see based off that information that, okay, maybe a substantial part of Peru can be affected, or maybe you have information which shows you that even the whole of Peru can be affected. But overall, you have to come up with a conclusion for which region do I aggregate my information. You can become then also more concrete. Maybe you aggregate per province, or maybe you even aggregate per catchment area, so that the river area, typically, there is a good chance that you have losses from the same event in the same catchment area, like the river Ebro. Or then even more detailed, you use scenarios which may be available, like maybe you know the Lloyd's RDS scenarios, or you define your own events. Then if all these aggregated figures are available, of course you have to compare them with a limit concept you have to define. And one way to do this is, of course, that you just say, maybe if you focus on events, that you say, the limit I'm ready to write in flood for a certain country or for a river basin is so and so much money. So very obvious that you have to set up a goal about what you are ready to write. And it's always helpful if there is a model available, of course, that you do some cross-checking of this really simple approach I present here against some model results. And if I would summarize the easy way of doing risk management, it's really like this. It depends on many factors. It's, of course, very relevant, the business volume you have. The flood risk as such is relevant. You can have countries which are less at risk. It's relevant what kind of hazard information you have at hand. Maybe other loss potentials are much more relevant. Maybe storm and fire is much more relevant, so you just forget about the flood part. It depends on the underwriting process. So really the takeaway is, if you go the easy way here, maybe you end up with a concept per country, per catchment area, but maybe you have then really a concept for different regions, which is different for different regions. So this was about the easy way. If we look very quickly only at the more complex way, this is then all about flood modeling, and Adam will go a bit deeper there in a moment. The typical approach probably is well known regarding flood modeling. If you build a flood model, you have to know about the hazard, what can happen where, with what frequency. You have to know about how your insured objects react if they are affected. You have to know the distribution, of course, of your values. So what I pointed out before, that you really know the location, that's key. And last but not least, you have to know the insurance conditions. And if you have all these very well merged in a model, you of course can calculate thousands of different scenarios, and what you end up with is a loss frequency relationship. And if I show this in this slide, and I see here things moved a bit around. So let me explain it here on the screen. So actually this red curve moved for whatever reason a bit up. That's our loss frequency relationship you get out of the model. So here we have the losses, here we have the frequency. And the typical, or I would say best practice approach we also use at Swiss Re is that you use as a risk metric for the complex approach that you use the shortfall, and shortfall is defined as the average of the 1 or typically 0.1% worst outcomes of your events minus the average outcome. And in other words, it just means we just look at the tail of your distribution here. And let's assume here our alpha is 1%, so meaning that we look at the losses which happen once every 100 years or more, seldom. If we look at this tail here and we take the average loss of the tail minus the expected loss per year, that's the shortfall. And that's a very good measure really to manage the risk of a whole portfolio if a model is available. So after the easy way, the more complex way, let me end with some uncertainties about location and correlation. Just to show you in very simple terms actually where the tricky things are regarding flood modeling. I mentioned before, what you should start with is you should have an exact address, you should have in the end an exact coordinate of your location. But it's very obvious if you have a large site like this and you come in with a coordinate, it plays a major role for your model if you are with your coordinate here or here. This set shows very quickly that if you just operate maybe with one location or one coordinate for a huge extent of a site, it can go pretty wrong. So checking things, at least the key locations with a map, is very useful. If you look at the flood zones, you then compare coordinates with flood zones. Let me also point out that flood zones available nowadays are not super exact. If you model a city or part of a city very detailed, you can expect very detailed results. But if you deal with flood zones available for the whole globe, you have to be aware that the accuracy is limited. It's really important to see that if you are 10 meters right of your flood zones, it cannot for sure mean that you have no risk at all. And I would like to demonstrate this just with 3 examples of the same area. So it's in the US, Philadelphia, on the most left side, the FEMA zones. In between the more conservative Swiss Re global flood zones you find in our CatNet service, and then the recently published flood zones of Factory Mutual. So the takeaway here is really keep in mind you have a limited certainty because the calculation approach for these flood zones calculation are different, and it depends a lot on details like a digital terrain model and so on. Then another uncertainty is information about your insured objects. Of course, thinking of a potential damage, it plays a major role if you have a flood protection in place. Could be like in the example here below, if you have, of course, a dam along your river, that can be a very relevant parameter regarding your risk assessment. Can be relevant to know if your insured object is a bit on higher grounds, or it's relevant to know are there any last second measures, I would say, you can take if a flood is expected. And obviously you know that even better than I do, it's often or mostly difficult to get such detailed information than for the insured location. Another tricky thing is really then if you think of major events, you have secondary factors, so to say, that it's not only the water which can trigger a headache, but it is more. So here a very nice example that wood can play a major role, and that's an example from Switzerland some time ago where we had an extreme flash flood, and you see the huge amount of trees which collected in this behind this dam here. And very obviously, if wood then is starting to block the spillway of the dam, it becomes very quickly very dangerous, because as soon as the water passes by on the left or the right hand side, even a dam failure could happen. Maybe you observed a bit the case in the US recently, in California. That was a similar case in the end, where the water passed not over the spillway but nearby, and that can become very, very dangerous. And my last example is about sediments. As soon as you are in a more hilly area with some slopes, sediments can play a major role. And in this case here, it was again a bridge which was blocked. The not so big river just passed through the city, and really a substantial part of the city was filled up to 3 meters with gravel. And also this is something you typically cannot model. And it's again here really helpful to have a look on a map, come up with some common sense if you have to go for the risk assessment. So I would like to conclude and tell you there are many models out there. We also develop our own models. They help a lot, mainly regarding correlation. They are of a big help. Nevertheless, I think it's also worth to say keeping things simple can also be a way. If no model is available, I would really do that. And keep in mind that there are two things very relevant. One thing is regarding risk assessment, the correlation, so that you make your mind up which areas can correlate, that you have a proper accumulation control. Maybe you start with a country-based accumulation control and go then more into the details. And the other point, and that's maybe even the most important one, location information is key. Make really sure that you know where your insured values are, and maybe pretty soon go along a line that you don't just accumulate sums insured or limits or something like this, but maybe that you assess an EML or a PML for that location, and you aggregate things like this to get a good overview. So this is what I wanted to show you about risk assessment. And then we dig again a bit deeper regarding flood modeling, and for that I hand over to Adam again.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. So thanks for describing the different simple and more complex approaches to flood modeling. I very much second the fact that model is just a model and it needs to be used with care. And it's not the answer for pricing. It's an input for pricing. At the end, it's not modelers' job to dictate the price. It's the underwriter's job to do that, and they are responsible for it. So the ownership is important. I will speak a little bit about the case of Canada, because I believe, and I'm a strong believer, if there is something to change, if people are taking flood risk, let's say they take care of it and they think it's important, you have to have an event. No event, people don't care. And that's the reality. Okay? Because there are other things where the resources are spent at every insurance, reinsurance, and every company. Unless you are pushed by someone, you are not doing anything. So, maybe there are some bright exceptions. So, the case of Canada. Just a few, this image is from Calgary. This actually is a modeled, it's a model. It's a flood extent similar what Peter was showed for. This is from our model, and this is Warsaw in Poland. Okay, so it was really a perfect storm, or I should say maybe perfect flood, perfect situation for Canada, perfect for a model developer. Okay, there's been lots of damages, but at the end, I think it was beneficial for the insurance industry in general. So there was a big event. Maybe reinsurers and insurance companies will have a different opinion on that, to pay the losses. Especially in Canada, where actually the losses were not insured, but they still pay them in most cases because of reputational risk. So there was a big event in 2013, two independent events, one in Alberta, in Calgary, one in Toronto. At the time, there was no overland flood product available. So in Canada, you cannot buy a commercial insurance for your house. You can only buy for what they call sewer backup, or what I call the brown water, okay? Not the blue water. The nice blue water you can't buy. The brown water coming out of your toilet you can buy. So the cover was not available basically. So after the event, of course, there was a lot of interest in the product, in flood, some sort of flood insurance. And I think it was partly pushed by the government, partly by the insurance association, and partly by the insurers themselves. Because remember, they paid for the losses which they don't charge premium for. And that's not exactly a good situation. In 2015, Intact, the number one, offered a comprehensive flood product. And because Intact is a big company, all the smaller insurance companies got scared and had to offer something as well. Otherwise, they'll lose market, or that was the perception. And there, there's so since the time, there's various solutions available. The more detailed models are from Impact Forecasting, JBA, Catrice. There is actually a model from Swiss Re as well, which I didn't put it there, but there is a model. And as of now, basically since 2015, more than 20 insurance companies underwrite flood, and they charge for it. So if you think, this event was actually good for the coverage or for flood for people in Canada, for Canadians. Now, of course, because everything is modeled now, some properties are so highly exposed, nobody insures them. So I think it will come later on in the questions about the cooperation between government, some intervention of government and other than commercial insurance only. So it has moved a big step forward. In general, Peter has spoken about cut models. We take it that cut models can be used for multiple reasons or multiple jobs. First of all, you want to calculate the rate. It doesn't really matter if you are a commercial, you have multiple locations and you want to insure your let's say portfolio by an insurance company, or if you are an insurance company, you need to work out the rate. It can be, the consumer can be anyone. And of course, that's linked with the new product design. The fact that you actually, as an insurance company, you want to come with a new product. Any actuaries here? Any actuaries? One? The people who are not afraid to say they are an actuary? I actually went to a conference in somewhere, and I went to a purely actuarial conference, and I realized actuaries are the same freaks as cut modelers, only they are freaky about different things. So they are turned on by something else, but it's the same thing.
Not so polite.
Anyway, so actuaries, the pricing actuaries are tasked to calculate the rate, okay, for the product. So this actually, rather than someone telling them the underwriter or the product, come with a rate, them having a tool to come with a rate is very useful. And then once you underwrite, you want to control your accumulations. Very important point what Peter already mentioned. And then you want to do maybe at the end, because you want to get reinsurance, you want to model the entire portfolio. So first example, this is Calgary again. It's a map. I also like maps. I'm not an actuary, so I really don't like tables, but sometimes I have to. This is a map of Calgary. The different colors with the different, the legend is here, the different percentages shows the pure premium or technical rate, what you would charge as a percentage of the insured value. So you can see, for example, that in the light orange is, let's say, 10 times, you will charge 10 times less than in the bright orange. Now, we actually, when I said 20 companies are using our data, what it really means, we gave the actuaries something they really wanted. The tables were for every postal code, and Canada has very detailed postal codes. They copy them. As part of the Commonwealth, they took it from the UK. So it's very detailed. It's 6 digits, so every block sometimes can have a postal code. And this is the same table, but for 30 by 30 meter squares. So the models are so detailed that for every 30 by 30 meters, it can actually tell you what should be the pure premium, not how much you should charge as an insurance company, because maybe charging, I'll show you later, this is the same thing, You put there that you are in here, Calgary, you put a 1 million TIV, that's house worth 1 million. You click a button and it tells you you should charge $3,000. Now, that may be too much, okay? And some Canadians will not pay it. Your product will just not sell. So maybe you want to exclude those, you don't want to offer at all coverage for houses which are in the dark orange zone. You just don't want to do it, okay? Or you will put a very low limit, so you will cover only 10% of the value, or high deductible. And then when it goes to the end customer, which I assume some of you are here as well, you have to read the conditions and choose which product version you want to choose. But these things are basically available for every country where there is a model. Sometimes, especially once the actuaries define the rates and they're happy with it, normally they want the underwriters and the final consumer want something which is more, which is easier to get. So whilst this is full of, this one is full of detailed numbers, people can get lost with it. The underwriter doesn't want to see that, and the client who is insuring the place doesn't want to see that at all, I think. So what we normally will produce as well is these risk zones. So you can see here 5 risk zone, actually 6. No color means no flood risk according to the model, which probably means that the insurance company will still charge something. I would, because why not to charge something if you can? Because there's always some residual flood risk from rainfall or something. Then you have low risk, low medium, medium risk, medium high risk, and high risk. And so these 5 flood zones, they are understandable. You are in a high risk zone, low zone, and so on. Now, if you note, actually in the brackets, I left in the brackets the numbers. And you can see that the high risk, the number is actually 25 higher than in the low risk. And it's so sometimes zone numbers 1 to 5 are confusing because you say, oh, zone number 5 is 5 times worse than zone number 1. Well, actually, it's 25 times worse than zone number 1. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay. Now, I also spoke about the new product design, and I think insurance companies can get very creative with offering different limits, different deductibles, so peril-related limits and peril-related deductibles. So, for example, in this case, you can see you have your, let's say, full limit, so 100% limit, no deductible. Let's say the premium, it's $10,000. And then let's say you include a deductible of 10,000. So 10,000 deductible is quite high deductible. If I was an insured person and I get this deductible for my house, I don't like this policy because deductible is just too high. Okay, it's not worth for me. The perception will be. And if you look actually, the premium reduction from 10,000, it only goes down according to the model to a little bit less than 9,500. So is it really worth offering such a big deductible for such a small reduction of the premium? If you believe the model, probably not. However, if you go to a limit, so right here, you offer a 10% limit for something very highly exposed, your premium will go from 10,000 to 5,000 here. So maybe for the very high zones, highly exposed zones, enabling people to insure their places with very low limit actually makes sense. You probably are wondering why I put there 1% limit case as well. Okay, because you said this cover is worthless. They'll basically pay for the fence fall down. Okay, so, but there are places, and one of them is, for example, Austria, where actually the flood cover is almost given with the wind cover, and the limits are very, very low. It's few thousand euros, which is always was a mystery for me, but once you know that they basically offer it as part of the wind cover and very limited, it makes sense. So it's very much, the conditions are very much related to the political situation, the government, the history, where you're a communistic country or not communistic country. Post-communistic countries like Czech Republic, everyone is insured because everyone had work. of course, in the paper. So it's a lot related, but the models can support insurance companies in developing products with different limits and deductibles. Now, the third use is accumulation control, and Peter has already mentioned that. And when we are traveling and speaking with companies around, in Canada, US, Poland, Czech Republic, it doesn't matter where, lots of companies will be doing accumulation using insured values only. And it's the first step. As Peter said, it's the first step. Doing any accumulations is to maybe looking at limits or TIV. But if you look at it, so you can see here on this case that you had in Quebec, so that's by province in Canada, Quebec is 29% of TIV, and Ontario has 39% of TIV. So you think that the Ontario is the most exposed. However, if you actually if you run and you say how much pure premium modeled is coming from those provinces, you get a very different picture. And you see that suddenly Quebec, only 29% of TIV, is actually generating 46% of potential losses. And that's an extra information for the underwriters, for the accumulation managers. And you can see that Ontario, whilst 40% of TIV, only generates 24% of potential losses. And if you actually divide these two percentages with each other, you get the last column, where you see that, for example, Manitoba is actually the worst. So there is only 3% of insured value, but it generates 7% losses. So whilst these numbers are small, it's actually 2.5 times more. So if you are all underwriting only Manitoba, you should really watch your potential losses rather than TIV you underwrite. This is just the conclusion, which I said. And finally, this is the last slide. Once you underwrite, you control accumulations, then the last step is really to model portfolio, get the exceedance probability curve, and see what are your 1 in 100, 1 in 500, 200 year losses. And also, this is just different insurance companies, and the dots is the position of the 2013 flood. So, for example, you can see here that for the black company V, the return period of the 2013 flood was 1 in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 50 and something years. But that's really, this portfolio modeling comes only as a last stage. Now, one of the important things is actually how are people getting access to data. And, you can, as I said before, the actuaries want to have access to data differently than the end user. So the actuaries want to have the tables, they want to make the rates. And so they want to see the files itself. There's different tools available. The tools are either Aon Benfield tools or impact forecasting tools, but also through third parties. Anyone has worked with a company called Spatial Key? Nobody knows? Spatial Key? Pitney Bowes? Someone should know Pitney Bowes for geocoding. So, we always say, if you like the model, there's no point, you should not be able to consume it in different systems. And there is lots of competition, how it's called, in the CAT modeling industry now. Finally, a few conclusions. So I spoke about the flood loss trends. There is an increase in the economic losses, but probably it's very hard to attribute it to one trend in climate. Probably increasing the insurance penetration and offering more products. There should be I think it's covered by the chart. Should be our goal, to making more things insured where necessary. And in terms of flood risk management, flood models, and I will echo here what Peter said already, can be very useful if they are detailed enough. You can see on the map here 2 models for the same city in Canada. And it's the same measure of risk, 1 in 100 year loss. Okay, and you can see there is a very different view. In the second view on the right side, you cannot underwrite anything in the city center because it's just all flooded. Or you can, but it will give you a different view. Whilst in the more detailed model, it's actually, it's more, let's say, positive. It's not so negative. So the models in general are getting more and more detailed. So it's usable for pricing individual locations with care. minding the other things. And in future, probably more important even for accumulation control. And next steps, in my view, don't get occupied by climate change too much, but don't deny it, because it is happening. The effects on flooding and flood losses can be discussed. More detailed models are coming, and it will help you to get insured, your property is insured, the insurance companies give you better rates, and it will also all go through reinsurance to actually make everything working in hopefully more streamlined way. But invest time to understand the model. Okay, don't take the model that this is the truth, because it's not the truth, it's a model, and there are multiple models available. And try to understand the uncertainties. As an example here, this is Netherlands. You can't actually buy flood cover in Netherlands for your house, which is really funny. So the property, I think 60% of the insurable properties are underneath the sea level, but nobody thinks that the flooding there is real, and nobody buys flood insurance. Yeah, because it's not offered. Actually, nobody. I think for commercial, there is a product, but not for residential. And there's an uncertainty. These are the different polygons here. There are dike rings. It's an area enclosed by a dike, and each dike has a return period of flooding. You can see here it ranges from 1 in 10,000, 4,000, and so on. And the numbers are very high. So building model based on this dike will crash or will fail every once in 10,000 years because some engineer said so. Okay, it's just an uncertainty. So when we developed the model actually there, we asked the engineers, the consultant, do you have a optimistic and pessimistic view? And I said, yeah, we have optimistic, which instead of 1 in 10,000 is 1 in 20,000, and pessimistic, which is instead of 1 in 10,000, it's 1 in 1,000. So we'll build actually 3 versions of the model, and this is the exceedance probability curve coming from the 3 different versions of the model. So this is really, you can't remove uncertainties, you can only understand them better. And yeah, as I already said, use the model where appropriate for all the different usages. And finally, this is the recent Canada, Quebec flooding comparing our flood extent, that's the red dotted line, with the satellite observed flood extent. So you can see that the models can be very, very detailed. Of course, there are differences, but in general, flood modeling has done a lot of big step forward in last, I would say, 10 years or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Well, now we have time for questions. So, Peter, I know that Swiss Re has invested a lot of time and effort in modeling. So you could tell us what challenges we face when trying to build accurate models to flood risk.
Yeah, building a flood model is really a challenge. Compared to storm models or quake models, it's really far more complicated. And I think I can explain that pretty visually. Just think of what's happening in case of a major flood is developing. So first of all, you have patchy rain patterns which spread over a certain area. Everything is moving. You have rain here, there, at different amounts. Then as soon as the raindrops reach the ground, it depends, is there vegetation or not? Is it paved or not? Is the soil dry or is it saturated? Then, of course, the water, which does not flow into the ground, starts to aggregate somewhere, typically initially in the rivers, of course, but then it can overflow here or there. Then you have protection measures which play a role. And typically the model should, of course, work in a similar way that we would like to go along the real process and come up with detailed affected areas out of one event. And if you think that the probabilistic model then deals with maybe thousands or even 10,000s of events, you can imagine that it's not an easy thing at all to define the hazard part. And I would say really the hazard part, maybe you remember the four-box model I showed before, that's the key challenge. And if we think then of the other parts, exposure information, if you do your job well, then of course you know where your insured values are. That's pretty simple then. From the experience, we know more or less pretty well how the damage looks like if you have a meter of water in a building. So, of course, it depends then on the industry you look at, but you have some experience there. Uncertainties are also there, but limited. And last but not least, insurance conditions are as well known. So in one or two sentences, the key thing, the key challenge is really defining the hazard properly in your model, having all the information at hand, and the other parts can be solved.
Thank you, Peter. But you have mentioned data. So I know from personal experience that obtaining the level of data that flood management requires is very difficult. So I would like to know your opinion about whether the insurance market has sufficient data to enable accurate flood modeling, and also is it possible to use the technology currently available to improve on this matter? Adam?
Okay, I will say my opinion about it, and then Peter can also add his views. I think in general there is a good data available, but again, only if there is a good reason for it. So whilst, let's say, for earthquake and wind, you only need to know the postal code maybe. For flood, as was already mentioned, you need the longitude and latitude. Now for you to get I always thought, and I was maybe idealistic in the beginning, that you as insurance companies within you here need to send a letter of renewal to the person who is insuring them, who is being insured. So the address information is available. But then later on I actually learned that it's not always available, which means it's not available, it's not in the system of the insurance company, but it's not given to the modeling, because the case of that it's important has not been made clear. So I think it's all about the data is in there, the street level data, the geocoding process of turning these street level data into the point, like longitude and latitude points are there. You know, everyone has access to Google. Even maybe their geocoding is not the best always, but Pitney Bowes, there are companies which are doing good geocoding. It's all about how to get this data inside the model to be used for the for the reason which is desired. So sometimes there's basically a challenge of convincing people from the data warehouse to write a new query, because it will take them another 2 days of work, and they cannot be basically asked to do that. And that's the reality, because the data is in there. Getting data can be a challenge. One thing I would say that if you are thinking about doing proper geocoding, test think systems like Google yourself, but don't always rely on free sources. Sometimes these free sources will be free because they are global, and global sources are always not the best sources. So we know, for example, that in many places Google, instead of doing a rooftop geocoding, will give you street centroid, and if the street is 2 kilometers long, it's actually worse than postal code. So that will be my point.
Thank you, Adam. Peter, as a reinsurer, do you have a similar point of view?
Overall, yes. I would also say there is really a good data source available, but I could also say there will never be enough data to come up with a really accurate assessment. But I would like to bring in also maybe another dimension. I think regarding data availability, it plays a role. What you have to do. Do you have to assess the risk of a portfolio, maybe with thousands of locations? Then you are well done, I would say, because you can live with quite some uncertainty at one location. But of course, if you deal with one corporate client, and maybe this client has just 10, 20 locations, and some of them are in a flood zone, there it becomes a bit tricky, because then you really have to deal with these inaccuracies I mentioned before. There you have to really see can I get some additional information about protection measures, or make your own scenario, what it could mean if you have a flood. And I think it's relevant to keep always in mind what task you have to solve, and then you will see either you have enough data or maybe really a lot is missing.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but maybe we have time for one question from the audience. Okay. We will give you a microphone.
Hello, I'm Maria Arana from Mars. My question goes to both of you, and in respect to, you might remember with the Hurricane Sandy losses in New York, there were some debates about storm surge and flood during those coverage. And the question will be, are those models, covering floods resulting from storm surge and pure flood, or you distinguish or exclusively doing just normal flood, like a river flood? And that will be my question to the models that you're working on. And the second question, also related to the models that you normally work on, is how is the ability of them to calculate not only the physical damage, but also the subsequent business interruption, and the ability of a client to return to business and his resilience, or the resilience of the location. Thank you.
How do you want to do?
I take the first one.
Oh my God. Okay, go for the first one.
I'll leave you the BI one. At Swiss Re, we develop on the one hand side river flood models, and on the other hand storm surge models, and you really have to keep them separate because the triggering event is pretty different. On the one hand side, of course, you have the rain. On the other hand, you have really the wind and the atmospheric pressure which pushes the water to the coast. And so from that point of view, very often the storm surge model is really linked to the tropical cyclone model, or it can also be a European winter or a European storm with a storm surge. Then you really link that to the storm model and cover things then beside this in a very similar way as what we have shown before. You just have other affected areas, of course, mainly along the coast. You have an idea, if you know about the topography along the coast, about which areas can be affected. But it's more than really related to a storm model.
All right, thank you. And I would just say, in terms of modeling, those two different phenomena, it's easy. The models are there. I think the problem is in US is how NFIP works. And it's a big market buzz. Everyone wants to do things in the US because it's a big, the flood, let's say, insurance being completely, for the last 5 years is changing towards being more private, because NFIP is in a loss. I think they're running in a loss consistently almost. So that's a big opportunity for everyone. In terms of the BI, as a model developer, as an insurance company or as a company who is getting insured, you should for sure take care as maximum as you can, because that's important. And that's what the models don't cover in generally well. So that's my advice for if you are insuring yourself in terms of model developer. It's so, let's say, the uncertainties in the basic model development, the basic physical damage are quite large. So we really start to first concentrate on those. The BI modeling capabilities, at least on our side, will be, I would say, simplified. We'll be taking some market experiences, loading the losses by a factor or something like this. There should be and I am sure that someone is working on more, let's say, detailed BI, especially contingent BI models, which is more about connectivity rather than the physical modeling itself. And it's a little bit linked with cyber as well from this point of view. But I think the modeling capabilities for BI are, in my view, not to be trusted that much. It's an indication.
Maybe to add to that, and I agree with Adam, I would say really BI losses where really the site is affected, that can be managed with maybe a simple approach, but at least you get something reasonable out of the model. If you think about non-damage BI, there really the tricky things begin, because there it becomes very, very difficult that if you really have to look into a multi-location situation, and you have to know the interaction between individual companies and so on. There, at least I don't know a model which covers non-damage BI well at the moment. There is a lot of common sense which has to flow into, but this is also the advantage that we still need the experts and cannot cover everything with a model.
Thank you. Does anybody have one more question? Carlos, Pedro.
Thank you. I would like to know if the inputs for all the models are the same, the water is the same, the location, the ground. Why are the results so different, apparently, between the players in the market?
You mean now different regarding things like flood zones? Or
yeah, flood zones, yes. I was surprised to see the areas, the flooding areas in the slide, and there were some important differences in the areas.
Yeah. So from my point of view, I think the key points regarding the difference is the approach you take to calculate the flood zones. So there are hydraulic approaches where you calculate flood routing along a river, and that's the one key point. And there are other, like our approach, for example, which is more a geostatistical approach. And then on the other hand, a lot depends also on the digital terrain information. And it's very obvious, if you know the terrain very detailed, that's a big advantage. Then you get better results. But still, what I also would like to point out is just your assumption regarding how a flood develops, or what flood stage you want to take, or what you assume, where would a dam break or whatever. All these assumptions play a role in the end regarding the extent of your flood zone. And assumptions are different, and then results are different.
Adam.
Yeah, just a small addition. To answer, because the data is, as you said, the data is not the same, almost. Always, for flood, there's a big diversity of data. And the methodology is not the same. And even if the data were exactly the same, which are more similar, let's say, for earthquake model, USGS, everyone, for US, it's the USGS data is the standard, the results can be also different. It's almost like giving a Ferrari to me and Josefina driving from Malaga to Granada. I will probably take different route.
Absolutely.
And I will be here probably slower because I will never arrive, okay? So everything for flood modeling, it's quite still in development, and the data is different. Every model makes a different choice, and that's why actually, I remember maybe 10 years ago when we developed a model and we were asked a question which was too detailed. We just said this is proprietary. We are not going to answer assumptions. Not going to tell you. Now we have to answer very detailed questions, and it's all about you understanding the assumptions about the model, making your mind, is this reasonable or not? So that's why I showed the Netherlands example. 3 possible ways how to go, 3 possible answers.
Thank you. Pedro, you had a question.
Yes, a question for Adam. Yes, I'd like to know if are there other models or modelers available in the market? Oh, thanks. Okay, I want to ask Adam just a question about if are there any other models or modelers available in the market, and which would be your strengths or weaknesses, if any, compared to other competitors?
I can make some advertisement now. Fantastic.
Well, just a few minutes. We are run out of time. Okay.
Of course, everyone knows there is. There are model developable companies like RMS, AR, and CoreLogic, which basically their main business developing models. We as Impact Forecasting, part of AUM Benfield, are I would call a small new model developer. I think 3 strengths probably: the fact that we are transparent, I think our models are scientifically robust, and we work with clients long term as being part of AUM Benfield. That's probably it.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to draw the round table to a close. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Adam, for sharing your views with us. It's been extremely interesting. And thank you for coming to this round table. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.